First story. I was always the kind of person who liked to stick to a plan. From a young age, I was taught that stability and predictability were the keys to success. I went to school, got good grades, and followed the traditional path that was laid out for me. By the time I finished college, I was ready to enter the corporate world as a junior analyst at a prestigious financial firm. It wasn't a dream job by any means, but it was stable. It was safe. I worked long hours, commuting into the city every day, spending my evenings in a small one-bedroom apartment. My social life was practically non-existent. By the time Friday night rolled around, I was too exhausted to even think about going out. My friends from college were starting families, traveling, and doing things that made their lives look exciting and full on social media. I, on the other hand, was quietly grinding away, saving for the future. I had convinced myself that this was the way things were supposed to be. One particular Thursday afternoon, things took a turn I didn't see coming. I had an early meeting with a client in a part of the city I wasn't familiar with. The meeting ended earlier than expected, so I had time to kill before heading back to the office. There was a small cafe on the corner of the street, and I decided to stop in for a coffee and maybe catch up on some emails. As I waited in line, I noticed a guy sitting alone at a corner table. He was dressed casually, jeans, a t-shirt, and worn-out sneakers. He didn't seem to fit the usual business crowd that frequented this part of town. He was typing furiously on his laptop, occasionally pausing to sip from his mug and look out the window. There was something about him that caught my attention, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. After I got my coffee, I found a seat by the window, but my eyes kept drifting back to this guy. Maybe it was curiosity or just a desperate need for something to break the monotony of my routine, but I felt compelled to strike up a conversation. I waited until he closed his laptop and stood up, preparing to leave. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding a little too eager. "Mind if I ask what you were working on?" He looked surprised for a second but then smiled. "Oh, just some freelance work. I'm a graphic designer." We ended up talking for the next 2 hours. His name was Jake. He was in his early 30s and had been freelancing for the last 6 years. Before that, he worked in advertising but left because he hated the corporate culture. He said he wanted more freedom and flexibility, even if it meant less stability. The more he talked, the more I realized how different our lives were. While I had chosen the path of predictability, Jake had done the opposite. He told me about traveling across Europe, taking on projects for clients he actually liked, and being able to work from wherever he wanted. It sounded like a dream, one that I hadn't even considered possible for myself. But what really struck me wasn't just the freedom he described, it was the passion. Jake genuinely loved what he did. He wasn't grinding away just to make it to the weekend. His work was a part of his life that he enjoyed, not something to be endured. I hadn't felt that way about anything in years. Before I left, Jake gave me his business card. "In case you ever need a designer or just want to chat about breaking out of the corporate world," he said with a wink. That conversation stayed with me for weeks. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I'd sit at my desk, staring at spreadsheets and emails, wondering if this was really what I wanted to do for the next 30 or 40 years. The answer, I realized, was no. It wasn't easy, but I started making small changes. First, I took up graphic design as a hobby, learning from online tutorials in my spare time. I wasn't great at it, but I enjoyed the creative process. For the first time in years, I felt excited about something other than a paycheck. As I got more comfortable with design, I started to take on small freelance projects on the side. It wasn't much, mostly logos and social media graphics for local businesses, but it was a start. My weekends, which had once been spent recovering from the work week, became dedicated to something I actually cared about. 6 months after meeting Jake, I made the hardest decision of my life. I quit my job. My parents were shocked. My colleagues thought I was making a huge mistake. But for the first time in years, I felt alive. That was 2 years ago. Since then, I've built up my freelance business to the point where it's now my full-time gig. I'm not making as much money as I did at my corporate job, but I'm happier. I travel more, I have more time for myself, and I wake up excited to start my day. The funny thing is, I ran into Jake again just last week at the same cafe. I told him what had happened since our first meeting, and he just grinned. I knew you'd figure it out, he said. Looking back, it's crazy to think that a single conversation with a stranger could have such a profound impact on my life. But it did. Sometimes, all it takes is a different perspective to make you realize that the path you're on isn't the only one out there. Second story. I never thought I'd end up in the middle of a movie set, let alone in the role of a stunt double. In fact, my life up until that point had been pretty average. I'm Josh, 27 years old, living in Los Angeles and working as an IT specialist. You know, the typical desk job where I spend hours fixing servers, updating software, and troubleshooting issues for people who probably shouldn't even be using computers. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. But one random Saturday, my life took a turn I never could have anticipated. It started innocently enough. I was heading to a local park to meet a friend for a pickup basketball game. It's one of those parks where you've got everything happening at once, people jogging, dogs running around, and kids playing soccer. There's even a spot that's often rented out for film shoots, but I'd never paid much attention to it. That day, as I was walking past the film crew, something caught my eye. A guy, probably in his late 20s like me, was standing by a food truck, dressed in this ridiculous superhero outfit. He had a bright red mask, a cape, and boots that looked straight out of a cheesy action movie. The weird thing? He looked just like me. Same height, same build, even the same scruffy beard. It was like looking in a mirror, except this guy was dressed like a knockoff superhero, and I was just in my basketball shorts and hoodie. I was still staring at him when one of the crew members, a stressed-out woman with a clipboard, walked over to me, eyes wide. "Oh my God," she said, barely able to contain her excitement. "Are you Jake's double?" I blinked, confused. No, I'm just..." But before I could finish my sentence, she grabbed my arm and started pulling me toward the set. "We've been looking for you everywhere." "The director is this close to losing it," she said, not giving me a chance to explain. I tried to protest, but it was like talking to a brick wall. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the middle of a film set, surrounded by cameras, lights, and crew members hustling around. The actual actor, Jake, was nowhere to be seen, and I was still trying to wrap my head around what was happening. "Okay, listen up," a guy with a headset said, approaching me. "This is a simple scene. You're gonna run, leap off that platform, and land on the crash pad. The explosion will go off behind you, but don't worry, it's all controlled. Just make sure you time your jump right, or you'll be in the blast zone." "Wait, what?" "Hold on," I finally managed to say. "I'm not." But before I could finish, they were already strapping a harness to me. The woman with the clipboard shoved a helmet into my hands. "Just put this on and you'll be fine. Jake does this all the time," she said with a smile, as if that was supposed to reassure me. At this point, I was in too deep. The cameras were rolling, the director was yelling for action, and everyone was staring at me like I was about to pull off the coolest stunt of the century. My heart was racing, and for a split second, I considered bolting off the set and making a run for it. But something inside me said, "Screw it. How many times in life do you get the chance to do something completely insane?" I wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. So, I took a deep breath, put on the helmet, and got into position. The platform I was supposed to jump off was about 15 feet high. The crash pad looked soft enough, but the fact that there was going to be an explosion behind me definitely upped the stakes. I wasn't a thrill seeker by any means, but there I was, about to take a leap into the unknown, literally. "Action!" someone yelled. I took off running. The platform was fast approaching, and I could hear the countdown for the explosion in my earpiece. The adrenaline kicked in, and before I knew it, I was airborne. For a brief moment, everything went silent, and I felt weightless. Then, the explosion went off behind me, a loud, fiery boom that shook the ground. I hit the crash pad hard, rolling to a stop as the flames roared behind me. The crew erupted into applause, and the director yelled, "Cut!" That was perfect. Perfect? I couldn't believe it. I was alive, and I had just pulled off a stunt that I never would have attempted in a million years. My heart was pounding, and my legs felt like jelly as I stood up, but I couldn't help the grin that spread across my face. As I dusted myself off, the real Jake finally showed up. He looked at me, then at the crew, and burst out laughing. "Dude, you just did my stunt," he said, clapping me on the back. "I can't believe it. How'd they rope you into that?" I laughed, too, shaking my head. Honestly, I have no idea. After the shock wore off, the crew realized their mistake, and there were a lot of apologies. But by then, I didn't care. I had just experienced the craziest, most exhilarating moment of my life, and I survived to tell the tale. The director even offered to pay me for the day, but I declined. The story alone was worth more than any paycheck. I mean, how many people can say they accidentally became a stunt double and pulled off a perfect scene on their first try? I went back to my regular life after that, returning to my IT job and the daily grind. But every now and then, when I'm stuck in traffic or dealing with some mundane problem, I think back to that day and smile. It's a reminder that sometimes, life throws you into situations you could never predict, and when that happens, you've just got to take the leap, even if there's an explosion behind you. I never planned to take that road trip. In fact, if you had asked me a week before, I would have told you I had no time for anything like that. I was drowning in work, juggling deadlines, and barely keeping my head above water at my marketing job. But sometimes, life has a way of forcing you to stop and take a breath. It all started with a phone call from my older sister, Sarah. She lives about 6 hours north of me, in a small town near the coast. We've always been close, but our lives had drifted apart over the last couple of years. She got married, started a family, and settled into small-town life. I stayed in the city, working long hours, and getting caught up in the chaos that comes with it. We talked occasionally, but it was usually brief, a quick check-in between responsibilities. That morning, though, Sarah's voice sounded different on the phone. Tired, stressed, like she had too much on her plate. "Jake," she said, "I need a favor." Her husband was out of town for a work conference, and she was overwhelmed taking care of their 2 young kids, while also trying to get her new small business off the ground. She needed a break, even if just for a weekend. "Could I come up and help out for a few days?" I hesitated. My schedule was packed, and I was already behind on a couple of projects. But something in her voice made me realize that she didn't ask for help often. She was always the one who had it all together, who never seemed to need anyone's support. If she was reaching out now, it meant she really needed it. "Yeah, I'll be there," I said, without really thinking about how I'd managed to fit it into my life. The next day, I packed a small bag, threw it in the back seat of my car, and hit the road. I wasn't expecting much, just a few days of babysitting, maybe helping her around the house, and catching up with my sister. But what I got was something completely different. About 3 hours into the drive, as I passed through a series of small, unremarkable towns, I felt something strange, relief. The further I got from the city, the more the weight on my shoulders seemed to lift. The deadlines, the pressure, the constant notifications on my phone, it all started to feel distant, like a different world. For the first time in months, I found myself actually enjoying the quiet hum of the open road, the way the scenery changed from strip malls and office buildings to wide open fields and dense forests. I hadn't taken a real break in years. My vacations were always short and crammed with activities, barely a pause before jumping back into the grind. But this drive felt like something else. I didn't rush. I didn't check my phone every 5 minutes. I just drove, windows down, radio on, letting myself relax. By the time I got to Sarah's place, I was in a completely different headspace. She greeted me at the door, looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen her. The kids were screaming in the background, the house was a mess, and she had bags under her eyes that told me she hadn't slept properly in days. "Thank God you're here," she said, pulling me into a quick hug. I thought I was going to lose my mind. The next couple of days were a blur of diaper changes, meal prepping, and chasing after her 2-year-old, Ellie, who seemed to have an endless supply of energy. I'm not going to lie, it was exhausting. I wasn't used to taking care of kids, and by the end of the first day, I had a newfound respect for Sarah and everything she managed to do on her own. But it wasn't just about helping her out. In between the chaos, we found time to talk, really talk. Not the rushed conversations we usually had over the phone, but long, meaningful ones about life, family, and how much things had changed since we were kids. She told me about how hard it had been to balance her dreams of starting her own business with being a full-time mom. I told her about the stress I'd been feeling at work, the burnout I hadn't even realized was creeping up on me. We laughed about how different our lives had turned out. Growing up, I always thought I'd be the one with the family and the house in the suburbs, and she'd be the career-driven one, living in a big city. But here we were, her with the kids and the small-town life, and me with the job that had slowly consumed everything else. On the second night, after the kids had finally gone to bed, we sat on her porch, drinking tea and listening to the crickets chirp in the darkness. "You should do this more often," she said, gesturing to the quiet night around us. "Take a break. Get out of the city." I shrugged. "I don't have time for breaks." "That's the problem," she said. "You never make time. You're always so focused on work, you forget there's more to life." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She was right. I had been so caught up in my job, in the endless pursuit of success and productivity, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just be, to enjoy the simple things, like a quiet night or a long conversation with someone who mattered. The next morning, I woke up early, before Sarah or the kids were up, and decided to go for a drive. I didn't have a destination in mind, just a need to get out on the road again. I found a small dirt path that led to a clearing overlooking the ocean. I parked the car and sat on the hood, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. I don't know how long I sat there, but in that moment, everything felt right. I wasn't thinking about work, or deadlines, or any of the usual stresses that consumed my daily life. I was just there, present, breathing in the salty air and listening to the sound of the ocean. That road trip was supposed to be a simple favor for my sister, but it turned into something much bigger. It forced me to slow down, to step outside of my bubble, and to realize that I needed more balance in my life. I couldn't keep going at the pace I was without burning out completely. When I left Sarah's house that weekend, I promised myself I'd make more time for things like this, for family, for nature, for moments of quiet reflection. It wasn't easy, and I knew I'd have to make some changes, but that trip gave me a new perspective on what really mattered. And honestly, I've never been more grateful for an unplanned road trip in my life.